Well, we've been coming through the book of the Genesis and laying this foundation really of which the rest of the Bible is on. This is the beginning, as the word Genesis means, the beginning of God's love story, if you will. And we've seen so many principles in this book that really are played out throughout all of time in many ways, and will continue to be played out throughout all of time. And as we look at the 21st chapter tonight, and I know that we were in the 19th chapter last week, but we'll look primarily for our text tonight in chapter 21 and use chapter 20 as a backdrop. But we see another one of those trends played out, and that is with the birth of Isaac, we see the promise of God delivered. And we see this trend that we've seen before to this point in Genesis, and we see ongoing here, the faithfulness of God. We all have our shortcomings, and we fall short, and we go back on what we mean to do, and we promise to be done. But God is faithful. God fulfills His promises. And can you imagine how long Abraham, or what Abraham and Sarah must have felt like all these years being promised this heir, this son, and year after year after year after year goes by, and it's not delivered. In fact, at this point, it would seem that Isaac is 14 years old, and finally, Isaac is born. But 14 years after, did I say Isaac? I meant to say Ishmael. 14 years after Ishmael is born. And this is a long time that this process has been going through. But something that's interesting to me is I remember as a child traveling places and asking Dad over and over and over and over again, are we there yet? And those rides seemed to take forever. In fact, a number of years ago, the kids were a little bit younger, and we drove to Disney from Blairsville, and we were just about an hour out of Blairsville, and one of the kids, I don't remember which one, said, how much longer? And at that point I said, a long time. But you know what we remember is not those long trips, is it? It's the vacation we had once we got there. It's the good times we had and all the joy we had. And there are situations in our life that are going to seem to drag on for what feels like forever. But there's going to come a time when we get our reward, when our promises are entirely fulfilled, that we'll look back and say, well, that didn't seem quite so long after all. And I feel confident that that is the situation with Abraham and Sarah. But if we look at the 20th chapter, we see this situation come back again that we studied and read about from Genesis, the 12th chapter. And in chapter 20, Abraham makes the same mistake. In fact, if we were to read carefully, we would see that Abraham, in explaining why he did what he did to Abimelech, he says to Abimelech, well, when we left our homeland, when God took me out of my land, I told Sarah, this is a favor I need you to do to me, or for me. If anyone asks who you are, tell them you're my sister. And so this is planned out, we see in the 20th chapter. And it's the second time that Abraham makes this mistake. And the 20th chapter plays on exactly that. Abraham and Sarah travel a bit to the south from where they're at. Scholars have all kind of ideas on why Abraham and Sarah start to move, and they move down into the fertile lands of South Judea. And some speculate that he was so depressed and so disturbed by the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and those other cities and the possibility of what may have happened to Lot and how his family was, that he had to move on. But additionally to this idea, I would add that Abraham is rather nomadic to begin with. In fact, the Hebrew writer addresses this. He dwells in a tent. That was the nature of his living. And so it wouldn't seem entirely out of characteristic or uncharacteristic of Abraham for him to make some amount of travel anyhow. But at this point, he travels into southern Canaan, and he comes across a king by the name of Abimelech. And what's interesting, and I had so many troubles finding pictures to illustrate a lot of these things, because some of the illustrations from chapter 21 show Sarah to be really, really old looking, and she was 90 years old. But I don't think Sarah was your average 90-year-old, because we see that she was desirable for Abimelech to take as a wife. And so Sarah by no means is the average 90-year-old. Now, I'm not quite sure what the average 90-year-old is, but what I am certain of is that Sarah is above average in many, many ways. And so Abraham, for the second time in this book, pawns her off as his sister. We see elsewhere that he does that for his own safety, that he's afraid that he will be killed to acquire Sarah. And very similar to the prior situation in Genesis, the 12th chapter, Abimelech comes into all kinds of problems. God puts a curse on his household until he figures out, in fact, God reveals to him, you've taken Abraham's wife. And he says to Abraham, why have you done this to me? And Abraham gives him somewhat of an explanation. So what's really interesting to me is that Abimelech gives Abraham all kinds of stock. He essentially gives him wealth. He says, I don't appreciate what you did to me, but here, I want to make you whole. I want to make up for the misunderstanding, if you will. And he gives him all kind of wealth to go on his way. Now, I've heard it said before, but I don't think it really applies to too many as well as it applies to Abraham. I've heard it said that so-and-so could fall into a porta-john and come out smelling like roses, or covered in roses, you might say. Well, that is certainly the case with Abraham. He does the exact wrong thing, and he comes out wealthier on the backside of that. And that leads me to our golden text. And that is the 21st chapter and verse 20. And I think this is the principle that runs through our text tonight. And in 22, chapter 21, and 22 through the end of that chapter, we see Abraham and Abimelech making a treaty together. But Abimelech makes an interesting statement in verse 22 when he says, at that time Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now, Abimelech, as I mentioned before, is getting ready to make a treaty with Abraham. But he starts it by saying, Abraham, I've noticed that God is with you in all that you do. In other words, even when you do what's wrong, God is blessing you. And that's an interesting statement. Christian read from Romans, the 8th chapter for us, and we'll come back here if you would and look at it again. But verse 31 says, what shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? If God is for us, who can be against us? And we see this statement made a couple places in Scripture. But Abraham's living it out. God was for him. So it didn't matter what was against him. Even at times, he himself was against the situation, against himself. He certainly didn't make the right decision when it came to Hagar and Ishmael. He certainly didn't make the right decision in Egypt in Genesis, the 12th chapter. He didn't make the right decision here in the 20th chapter. But the fact of the matter is that God was with him. And so everything he did prospered. Now, I think the Christian can take confidence in that. That doesn't mean everything in our life's going to work out. The principle is that God is going to work our lives out. As we studied with the young kids today, if we put God first in our life, everything else will sort out. Doesn't mean everything's going to go well. It means that it's going to work out. You say, well, Mike, Abraham did exactly the wrong thing, and you said he was still rewarded for it. Evie, if I paid you not to clean your room, the same amount as I was willing to pay you to clean your room, just for the record, Evie doesn't get paid to clean her room. But if I offered you the same amount of money, I'm going to pay you $10, Evie, if you clean your room. But I'll pay you $10 if you don't clean your room too. Which are you likely to choose? Not to clean your room. I knew, I had sneaking suspicion that that would be the case. And you say, well, Mike, if God is going to reward people whether they do right or they do wrong, then why would anyone do what's right? Well, that's kind of the exact, not kind of, it's the exact question that Paul asked in the 6th chapter, isn't he? Romans 6 and 1, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live there in it any longer? And I believe that's what we see exemplified in Abraham's life. God is blessing him, and God is going to use him to fulfill his life. And at times he makes awful mistakes. But he doesn't use those occasions to say, oh, wait, it doesn't matter whether I do right or not. I'm just going to be wrong. Instead, we see a life that's willing to continue the drive forward and to do what he can and to pursue God. You see, for Abraham, it wasn't about bribery, was it? For Abraham, it was about pursuing his God. And when we as Christians pursue God, we can be comforted and have confidence in the words of Paul. What shall we say then? If God is for us, who can be against us? So with that, let's go ahead and look at Genesis, the 21st chapter. And we see the birth of Isaac here in the first 7 verses. Starting in verse 1, the Lord visited Sarah, and as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son, who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone here who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I've borne him a son in his old age. Now there's a number of things here that's interesting. Number one, to me, that first verse, that God visited Sarah. That's terminology that oftentimes I've just overlooked in life, but I've started to note it. And I ask you, as you read through Scripture, note that terminology, when God visited, because we see it throughout the entire Bible, really, that terminology. And oftentimes God describes His workings and what He does in ways that people can understand. I think that's one of the cases, that my children understand that when Dad comes to visit, He's almost never empty-handed. In fact, Evie, I was on the Zoom call with the youth Monday, and Evie was sitting next to me and looking over, and who walked in? You remember? Grandpa. Yeah. He walked in the middle of the Zoom call and talked for a few moments, but what did he have with him? One package? 2 packages of cookies. He saw that we were into something. He set them down and left without his cookies. Left them there. He never comes empty-handed, does he? And God had promised to do this for Abraham and for Sarah. And the terminology used is when God visited. It means that God fulfilled His promise. But it's not to mean that God wasn't with them in the interim, that He wasn't with them on the journey. But Peter's were staying on Wednesday nights. In the 2nd chapter, uses the phrase on the day of visitation. The day of visitation was and will be, both in the past tense and in the future, for visitations of the past and for the ultimate visitation of the Lord in the future, is both a positive and a negative. When Amanda visits my office, that can be a very good thing, Jerry, or she may be coming in there to complain about the milk I spilled, right? It depends on my positioning, right? And such is the case for God. I think there's a principle there for us to be mindful of that. We have a God who's done everything for us, that we ought to live for Him. We ought to be mindful of that, so that the visitation of the Lord is a positive thing in our lives. So she bears Isaac at 90 years old. In fact, Isaac means he who laughs, or means, he laughs. The name means he laughs. There are so many layers, I think, to that name. You'll recall just a chapter or 2 before, when Abraham and the 3 angels are sitting outside the tent. The angel says, I'm going to come back in a year's time, and Sarah's going to have a child. And Sarah's inside the tent, and she laughs. Sarah then says about Isaac, he who laughs, or he laughs, that God has made me laughter, or has made me to laugh, I believe the King James says. In the King James, I think, is actually a little clearer here than this verse, than the ESV. It says, and anyone who hears will laugh with me. He's saying this is out of the ordinary. How incredible is this? If we believe in a God who's able to speak creation into existence, if we believe in a God who's able to bring 10 plagues upon the Egyptians and deliver His people, a God who's able to split the Red Sea and for His people to walk across in dry land, to be followed by those who are not His people to be drowned. Is it really that far-fetched to believe in a God who's able to cause a 90-year-old woman to conceive and bear a child? or for that matter, a virgin. Or for that matter, whatever it is that you need in your life. Remember, Abimelech noted of Abraham, in all that you do, God is with you. Paul, in a similar vein, said, what shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? And so verse 7, Sarah asked an interesting question. Verse 7 reads, and she said, Sarah, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Well, that would be God, right? That would be God. You see, she's saying everyone else would have laughed at this idea, but God's made it true. I believe there's a lot of things in our life that would fit that very mold. If you would read with me verses 8 through 14, and we'll see the departure of Hagar and Ishmael. Starting in verse 8, and the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman for her son. With her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Verse 13, and I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And so we mentioned that Isaac's name means he laughs. And can't you imagine, we read that this event occurred when Isaac was weaned. Most seem to believe that Isaac was likely around 3 years old. And so Abraham has this feast to celebrate the weaning of Isaac, a stage of life that he's recognizing has been moved past and has been matured through. And can't you picture little Ishmael, who was likely about 17 years old at this time? So not necessarily that little, but a young man, making fun of that name. You know, children, particularly at that age, preteen and teen, can be vicious, can't they? I hid my middle name desperately throughout high school. I'm not embarrassed by it now. But boy, I did not want those fellow teens to get a hold of that name when I was in school. Although interesting, Dave, any dealings I have with New York life, I'll come as Michael Homer Smith, because Matt Steinman was my initial and first New York Life agent. So he made sure he put my full name on everything he did. Kids make fun names all the time, right? And not just kids. Amanda was partially insistent in dropping her middle name when we got married and keeping her maiden name as her middle name for that reason, because of her initials and what they might have been. You'll have to ask her what those are. But people make fun names. So I picture Ishmael here laughing, and probably mocking and making fun of Isaac. Oh, he laughs and laughing at that. I would laugh for you, but Christian takes all those sound clips and makes a montage of them. So, no. So you'll have to use your own imagination there. But he's mocking them. Well, this is a sensitive situation at best, right? And understandably so. Sarah is not going to tolerate this whatsoever. And we see not only the past being an issue, and this is the way a lot of situations when we leave God's will and we make mistakes and we go down the wrong path end up in our lives. They become an entangled quagmire of difficulty in our lives. And it does mean we can't move past them, but it does mean that they're going to continue to be a challenge for us. So Sarah's not only upset over what's going to happen or has happened in the past, but she says, Abraham, this boy shouldn't be an heir. She's looking forward, isn't she? Noting that ongoing difficulty that is taking place. And so they're sent out. And we see here that Abraham is distressed by this. And God comes to him and says, no, Abraham, I'll take care of this boy. I'll see to his well-being. In fact, he's going to be a great nation himself. And so they leave. Again, it was really hard to find a picture. If you find most pictures or representations of this event taking place, Ishmael is just a wee little kid. And then one of the issues you'll note with this picture, where it looks like Ishmael's probably the appropriate size and age, Isaac looks a little bit big just to be weaned, doesn't he? And so those are some of the issues that artists have to look at. But Sarah doesn't look bad for 90 years old, does she, in this picture? Verses 15 through 21, if you will. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. And she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. When God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and drank, and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. And so here we have God providing for Ishmael. We talked about God providing for Abraham, and now we turn and we look at God providing for Ishmael. You can understand, I believe, quite well Hagar putting him under a bush, giving him some shade. Seems like a hopeless situation. And she goes out a ways away from him so that he doesn't see her weeping and cries out. Says, don't even let me see my son die. Heart-wrenching and difficult situation. But God calls out to her and says, don't give up. Opens her eyes. She sees the well. He says, go get him. And he's going to do all right. He's going to do more than all right. It's going to be a mighty nation. And so how did God provide for him? Number one, he showed Hagar where the well was. And then Ishmael had to learn to use that bow, didn't he? Ishmael had to learn how to provide for himself. But God was actually providing for him every step of the way. And so I think there's some lessons there for me. That God's in control. The glory is always His. But some principles that I need to be mindful of is to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Not to lay down and quit, not to give up in defeat, but to keep pushing forward and to keep striving and to give glory and gratefulness to God. There's not many of us here in person tonight, but we're really grateful for you joining us online. And if we can help you in any way, we encourage you to reach out to either the church office or to myself. If we can help you with a spiritual need, we can pray for you. If we can help you in any way, I encourage you to let us know what we can do for you. Likewise, if there's anyone here that has a spiritual need, would like to ask for prayers or any encouragement from the congregation, please come forward as together we stand and sing.